Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon and welcome to the post 95. How to examine a PhD. This vlog is 10 years in the making, and so many of you have been with me through these 10 years, moving from a PhD student to an early career researcher to a mid-career researcher. It has been joyful for me to walk with you through this process. And one of our great humans who are part of this amazing community, wrote to me. He's finished his PhD with all of us and is now an early career researcher. And he messaged me with some concern. Let me tell you what happened. He is an early career researcher and he found a post on Facebook, in a Facebook group, where a just finished PhD student, now an early career researcher, had abused the living hell out of a particular PhD and a particular PhD student. She was really oversharing how truly dreadful this PhD was, and what was the supervisor thinking, on and on and on. And then if one went through the 90 plus comments under this particular post, all sorts of stuff was, maybe the supervisor was a bit busy, maybe the student is happy with major corrections, and this went on and on and on for 90 plus messages. And not one of those messages, not one, said, "Girlfriend, you have just finished your PhD. What makes you an expert in international standards for doctoral education?" So our friend on this channel, the legendary Super D messaged me and sent me the link and said, "Tara, this is exactly what you said. A data point of 1, and then generalizing that single PhD experience to ruin other PhD students' lives." And I went, "Yep, that's exactly what it looks like." And so he asked me in this post to enact for you direct training on how to examine a PhD. He doesn't have a PhD to examine now, but he wants to do this training with me, and he wants to read existing PhDs and test out writing a report so I can have a look at it. So this is wonderful, so that when the opportunity presents itself, he is able to, with professionalism and care and decency, examine this PhD so he knows what he is doing beyond a data set of 1. So by the end of this session today, you will know how to examine a PhD. I am presenting a methodology for you and your consideration. And I think this will probably be pretty useful for our PhD students currently enrolled, because you get to actually see how an examination takes place. And this is very rarely talked about. And next week we will investigate and talk about the oral examination component as well, because really the written assessment and the oral component come together to create the examination of a PhD. And so next week, I think Doug was terribly interested in this. Hi, Doug. So we're going to be looking at the oral examination next week as well. And again, for early career researchers, that is incredibly useful, because you rarely get to think about what that looks like until you're in the middle of this really stressful, often chaotic situation. Now, I also note that right now, today, these two protocols are required more than they ever have been in the history of doctoral studies because of AI, generative AI, and we have strategies that we're going to talk about to address these matters. And I'm aware all sorts of stuff is going on about generative AI, and a bunch of, inverted commas, PhD influencers, can you believe this stuff, are explaining how to use generative AI in a doctoral degree. Okay, so in this sort of bizarre environment, doctoral supervision must change, but doctoral examination must change, and radically. Remember, the PhD is the highest qualification granted in our universities, except of course the higher doctorates. That's the only exception there. And research and academic integrity must be absolutely guaranteed, must be verified, and of course examiners must be accountable for the grading that we enact. Because if we fail to examine with precision and decency and compassion and repeatability, then we are allowing another human being to gain a degree, a PhD, and from our decision, that human can then go on to supervise and examine others. Okay. Most universities have particular benchmarks to ensure a person can examine a thesis, so particular characteristics. And let's go through them. The first one is obviously the cliche. You've got to have a doctorate to examine a doctorate. You've got to hold it to examine it. The second is you have to be research active. That has a lot of definitions around the world, but at its most reified, it's 5 research outputs in 5 years, 5 in 5. That's research activity. You must not have a conflict of interest with the student or the supervisor, and that includes personal and professional relationships, and you must hold the disciplinary expertise in this field, and that's proven through the proxy of publications. And there's often something else using language like you are in affinity with the approach of the thesis. What that means is if it's a Marxist thesis and you voted for Donald Trump, you're not in affinity with the thesis. So it's just making sure that you don't have to agree with the approach, but you understand it on its own terms. Okay, so when you hold all these requirements, you can now examine a PhD. But how do you do it? Well, that's our task for the day. I will offer just one more final twist in the tail of this session that does make me laugh when I wake up at 2 a.m. in the morning. I laugh about it still most mornings. Now, nearly 10 years ago, I proposed to my then university that I construct a 4-week course on how to examine a PhD, and it was going to cost about $1,000, and I was happy to pay for that. It was going to be my work, my effort, so I was happy to cover any of the costs as well. And the then DVCA, in charge of special projects, sorry, inverted commas, special projects, stated that it was not in the interests of the university to train PhD examiners, and no one would be interested anyway because everyone knows how to examine a PhD. Now, can I say this DVCA 10 years ago was research inactive, so he wouldn't have been allowed to examine. He's research inactive today. He would not be allowed to examine. Thanks for playing. So here we are, 10 years later, with more PhD students than in any point in history, multiple modes of doctorate, so the equivalence is quite challenging to configure. We have research and academic integrity issues proliferating around the world, and more threats to the standards in higher education than at any point in our history. And we're letting people with experience, a data point of 1 rather than expertise, a vibe rather than a methodology, examine our PhDs. There is another way. So together, let's examine a PhD. Now, a PhD is a course. It is a degree, and a PhD examination is an assessment for this course. All educational assessment is about measuring something. So we'll talk about what is being measured in a second. But because it is an assessment, a PhD examination is not about a vibe. It's not about emotion. It's not about subjectivity. It's not about comparing to your data set of your own PhD. That's actually irrelevant. So what are you measuring? You are measuring the capacity to construct new knowledge. This new knowledge must be transparently constructed and scaffolded, and this scaffold to the new knowledge must be repeatable and it must be accessible. We must be able to determine that there is a significant original contribution to knowledge present, and verify and check the methodology, the theoretical components, the empirical scaffolding to that SOC. We have to ensure that academic and research integrity matters are in place. So you as an examiner, you are checking. Your job is to verify that this thesis meets the international standard for a PhD. Institutions can help examiners work through what's often called the threshold standard. All institutions have policies for their doctoral examination. A couple of them that I've written over the years, I've put in the reference list at the end of this post. But most nations have specific standards for what is required of a PhD. Now in Australia, that's AQF 10, the Australian Quality Framework 10. In New Zealand, it's NZQF 10. They're both very similar in terms of benchmarking, but that is the highest benchmarked standards in a university. AQF 10. There is nothing higher than that. So this is serious. This is not subjective. This is not about your opinion. You need to take all the emotion out of this process, and you need to park your data set of one, your own thesis. Remember, the only role of your PhD in this process is to get you to the benchmark standard of what is required for a PhD examiner. You've got to hold it to examine it. That's the only role of your PhD in this process. But what are we here to do? Well, we're here to evaluate if new knowledge has been constructed. And then the process, the scaffolding to that knowledge, we need to check that. Okay, so in doctoral examination, we do not give students the benefit of the doubt. We can have affinity and care and compassion for the student, but this is too serious to simply assume for the best, assume that it's going to be okay. You as a PhD examiner exist to uphold international standards for doctoral education. You must take this seriously. You are the gatekeeper of academic standards. Therefore, the PhD examination process is searching for errors or flaws or missteps. Now, I know this seems negative, but you see, we have to be critical because this is the highest assessment protocol that exists in our universities. And if we allow academic or research integrity breaches and we allow them to move through the assessment protocols in our universities, then all other standards for all other degrees must be questioned. We are accountable, and this really matters. So let's begin. Let's do it. I want you to open up a Word document, and on that Word document for your examination paper, you have your name, the student's name, the name of the thesis, and the date in which the examination takes place. Bang. Now I want you to put into this blank Word document a series of headings. Introduction, rationale for the study, structure of the argument and analysis, the significant original contribution to knowledge, scope and scale, academic protocols, research protocols, concluding comments. Now I've put that list in a little page at the end of this post. So if you didn't get that, they are listed for you at the end. So depending on the thesis discipline, other headings may be added, but mostly they're not. Those headings will get you through an examination, and under each of those headings, what you're aiming for is 2, 3, 4, or 5 paragraphs under each heading. So a report spans between 2 typed pages and 5 typed pages. The better the thesis, the shorter the report. The more challenging the thesis, the longer the report. Now, some examiners, they have their report and then they have a sheet of corrections after it where they list all the typographical, grammatical, spelling errors that exist in the thesis. And I know for students and supervisors, their horrific list is like, this is what's wrong, team, this is what's wrong. And they can be quite challenging to read. But can I say, if an examiner does that, wow, they speed up the corrections enormously. But if you are going to do that as an examiner, then start it right at the commencement of your project, because it takes a lot of time. Most people don't do this. They provide indicative stylistic errors under each of those headings. But if you want a list of those types of corrections, you have your report, and then you list it at the end. So as you can see, the examiner's report is a living document from the moment you receive that thesis to examine, and you move it through your examination methodology that we're going to talk about. So you've set up your headings, we're aiming to fill those headings through the process. And then of course, once you've done your methodology, you then read the full report, fill in any gaps or meta issues you'd like to address, and send it back to the university. So here is the examination methodology that I deploy and I teach to others. Now, what I do is I conduct 3 separate iterative readings of a thesis. The first reading is I read the reference list, I read the introduction, and I read the conclusion. Now, the second read, I do what's called a granular read. So I read everything in the chapter order presented by the student. So I go finity for the thesis. I go into their project on their own terms. Then the third and final read, I have multiple screens up. I wish I could say I have 2 screens up. I actually have 3 screens up, and I verify the thesis arguments, and I check every single reference and every single quotation. So there's the thesis on one screen, I verify the references on the other screen, and I have my report on the third. So this is increasingly important in a time of phantom references and phantom quotations. So everything is checked. As the old line goes, it's never been easier to plagiarise, but it's also never been easier to find that plagiarism. And through each of these 3 iterative readings, you add to the report that you have going, all those headings. So all the way through, you're adding to that report. Then after those 3 readings of the thesis, you draft that report into a nice, smooth, coherent protocol. It's going to be kept by the student forever, so it's important that it is respectful and decent. And if it is a magnificent thesis, they can use that in refereeing and all sorts of things going forward. But you add granular content. Okay, so by the conclusion of the 3 readings, 1, 2, 3, you are in a position to grant a particular grading to the thesis. Now, every nation state, most universities all have quite different grading, but there is a normative structure which I will give you now. There are often some form of 6 gradings for a doctorate. The first is a 1 or A. This is rare. It's more common in the British and the Finnish systems, but about 6 to 10% of theses get a 1 or an A. That is straight through, no corrections. It's rare, but very special. The 2 or the B is the minor correction. And this assessment is very, very common and encompasses that a thesis, okay, it's solid, it's good, it might just need 1 more draft, there's just too many typos in there, there's a little bit of referencing inelegance, there's a little bit of a chapter that needs a little bit of sharpening. So just some small elements are required to address, and then it's straight through. Also, a 2 is often given, or a B is given, if there's some internal inconsistencies in the thesis. So just making sure chapter 2 and chapter 6, those comments match. Okay, to the 3 or the C, that is major corrections. So, right, okay, we're doing all right, it's fine, it's solid, but there's something wrong in a chapter. There's something wrong in an entire section of a chapter. A chunk of research may have been missed. It won't alter the trajectory of the argument, but completeness is required. There's just a little bit of patchy coverage there, so we need to do a little bit more. There might be a misstep in methods, methodology, and the literature review, but all of this is okay, it's sound, but we just need to do a little bit more work to fill in those gaps. Now, the 1, 2, 3, ABC, that's often termed as above the line, and that is a pass, a clean pass of a thesis. Now, we'll discuss next week this first reading that we're doing in most universities and most systems around the world, that's the provisional grading because you go to an oral examination and the final grade is determined through the oral exam. The grade can change in relation to the oral examination. It can change, often doesn't. Basically, if you've got your thesis above the line and you can answer questions to confirm research integrity in the oral examination, you are cool, rock and roll, thanks for playing. But of course, the grading doesn't stop. We're then below the line and we're at a 4 or a D. Now, often this grading stops the examination process. So the report is written, but the student doesn't progress to an oral exam. So we stop at this point and the student has to take back the thesis and do more work. So there's a relatively serious issue here. There's a scope and scale problem. There is a methodological problem. The significant original contribution to knowledge and the scaffolding to get there is lacking, and the student actually needs to return to the university and complete more work. It'll be okay, but they need to do a bit more, and the best examiners tell them the extra work they have to do to get there. If you can do that in your report of a 4 or a D, you will save a student's life. Great. Then we get to a really stupid grading, which is a 5 or an E. This is ridiculous, right? But it exists, so I'll talk about it. So what the 5 or the E is a master's degree is awarded for a doctorate, right? So you submitted it as a doctorate and they go, yeah, nah, it's a master's degree. Now, firstly, I hate this because it's disrespectful of a master's degree. You know how much I adore master's degrees. They are important in and of themselves. They are not a substandard doctorate. They are a master's degree. And so this is rubbish for me. This is like a master's is a master's, a PhD is a PhD, assess it. But the 5 or the E exists if I give it the benefit of the doubt. It exists, say it's a good thesis. It's a good thesis, but there's no SOC. So it is a synthesizing thesis, so therefore a master's is given. Now the 5 is given rarely, very rarely. When I've seen it given, it's given with, let me try and be classy here, it's given with great vulgarity. It's given as a booby prize for a bad PhD. So nonsense, but it exists. Then we get to the 6 or the fail. This is a fail. The thesis is failed with no chance of revision, no chance of resubmission. And look, about 1%, in fact, under 1% of theses fail. So this is small. And in my entire career, and I'm incredibly old, I have seen 3 failed theses. And trust me, they are a fail. They are a fail. So they've arrived for you and they look like an undergraduate essay. And can I say, not a very good one. So there's nothing to improve or enhance. It's just too small. There's too much wrong with it. Okay. Also, the fail can be used in some systems if there is a research or academic integrity breach. So after that process has gone through, in some systems, a fail is then granted. Mostly what occurs these days, if a research or academic integrity matter is confirmed, the thesis is removed from assessment. So it's no longer being assessed and it's going through the research misconduct policy procedures and so forth. Okay, so you've set up your examination doctorate. You have the methodology of 3 reads and you know the grading protocols that you're after. So let's now finish off our post this week by getting into those 3 reads. What are we looking for in each of those approaches? So what are you looking for? What are you attempting to evaluate in each of these readings? Right, so if it helps you, the meta point I want to make for you in this gig today is when you examine a thesis, it involves you zooming in with granularity, but then zooming out to see the whole picture. And you've got to do both. You've got to get used to in, out, and then reconcile that assessment. The details have to be right. The big picture has to be right. They both have to be accurate and they both have to connect, to be frank. But when you receive the thesis and you've put up your setup document, so you've got your examination process ready to go. You've got the bespoke institutional regulations, you've got your marking schema, and remember they differ per institution. Once you've got all of that ready to rumble, we're at the first read. And what we do in the first read is we read the reference list, the introduction, and the conclusion. So you start with the reference list. The entire history of this thesis is determined in that reference list. Once you see what's going on there, you know what you're about to read. Firstly, you're looking for breadth and depth. You're looking for scope and scale in the research. Now, I can't put a page length on the reference list. I'm asked about it all the time. If I'm forced, I'd say anything below, and I'm amazed I'm saying this to myself, anything below a 20-page reference list. Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Anything, and I'd say 20 is like, but let's just, anything below 20 is like, we're in trouble here, girlfriend. Danger, Will Robinson. Okay, so you're looking at the reference list. You're looking at length, but length is a proxy for scope and scale. So you're looking for breadth. Do they understand the discipline? Have they got the specific depth required for this topic? Now remember, you are an examiner. You've been hired to do this job because you're an expert in this field. So you're now looking for the 20 big names in your field. Are the 20 big names there? And if they're not there, scope and scale is lacking. Remember, you are hired because you are an expert. So show that expertise. Now, if those key names are not there, that is a sign of patchy research, incomplete research. Right, so that's the first one. Then you look at the reference list and say, right, are there weird things happening here? And by weird things, I mean you start to see dictionaries, encyclopedias, or undergraduate textbooks. So what you learn from that particular data set is that low-level materials have been used to supposedly construct a high analysis. You see the problem. So if low-level work is deployed, that's a sign of we got a problem with the pitch, with the level of the thesis. So then we're looking at the date of the references, and approximately 20% of the research should be in the last couple of years. Tell you why. Remember, what we're looking for in a PhD is a confirmation of the significant original contribution to knowledge today. Not 5 years ago, not 3 years ago, today. So a SOC must be verified today by the current recent research in that reference list. Now, if the reference list is a bit tired and a bit old, then the capacity to prove that SOC is limited. Now, I'm not saying historically important material shouldn't be there. In fact, I'm saying the exact opposite. There must be the big names, names, darling, names. They must be, all the important legacy material must be there, but the student must cite the original research from the now to prove that their research has currency in the now. We need the big names, we need the new stuff. The best of reference lists have international scope and are working through multiple languages, so check for diversity, check for global reach, and also if there's some great multimodal material, there might be, the nitro stuff, there might be some podcasts, there might be some videos, might be some grey literature. All of that is great because it shows innovation, a desire for completeness. Tremendous. So this is the first read, and you're also focusing on the introduction and the conclusion. So if the intro and conclusion are short, ill-focused, unresolved, they don't specify the SOC, you're already at a 3, to be frank. So if the intro and the conclusion is not doing its work, you're at a 3, and perhaps you're tumbling already to a 4. So the intro and the conclusion must frame your research. It must build the case for the development of knowledge. It must shape the research. It is a lens, but it's also a frame, and you need to confirm the SOC. So remember, the PhD is a genre. It's a way of writing, and the introduction and the conclusion confirm the genre of the PhD. Remember, the PhD is a genre, and it exists through the intro, the conclusion, and the reference list. That determines we know what's going on. So at this point, At the end of the first read, write your comments, and I'll particularly focus at this point on academic protocols, scope and scale. Was the referencing correct? That goes into your academic protocols. So write about the strengths and the weaknesses of the introduction in your scope and scale section, but also in the SOC. Right. So we've done our first read, methodology 1 done, brilliant. We're now moving to the second read, and this is the granular one. Now this can be done on paper or on screen. And just so you know what I do, the first read is on a screen. My third read is on a screen because I need the multiple screens to check and verify the references. My second read, this one, is often on paper. But it's absolutely about your comfort. But just so you know what the eye tracking research shows, when you read on a screen, this is interesting stuff. When you read on a screen, your eyes tend to go in a circular movement. When you read on a piece of paper, it goes left to right in a linear fashion. Both are fine, but just be aware of the different reading modalities when you're examining a thesis. So as I'm completing my second granular read, I've got the examination report up on the computer, and I'm adding to that report all the time. And of course, if you're doing that list of typographical errors, this is the read where you're catching it. So on page 30, boof, on page 32, boof, you're doing that list on this read. So the second read is assessing if the SOC is developed and sustainable throughout the thesis. Has the literature review configured an overt gap, and does the research emerge from that gap? Does the methodology, the research design, nest with the data collection and the data analysis? Cool. So noting that a large chunk of the theses that I examine are theoretical theses, very specialist, very different at the moment. High theory theses, capital T, have a very different structure. And so they're very intricate to examine because there's a lot of high theoretical work. And the key in these theses is originality confirmed, because often theoretical theses are dense and complex and they can fall into a synthesis. So when you're doing a theoretical thesis, you're always looking for where's the originality. You need to see the great engagement with 100, 200, 300,000 years of theory, but you also need to see what's the originality here. So that's the test if you're doing theoretical examinations. Now also with artifact exegetical theses, I read the exegesis first because I need to see that there is an original contribution to knowledge before I look at the artifacts, which may be furniture, which may be poetry, which may be a novel, which may be a soundscape. So the exegesis moderates and frames the artifacts. So this second reading also explores if the structure works. Does the argument develop? And remembering last week, does form and content align? So in this read, we're assessing the academic protocols. Can the student write? Look at sentence construction, look at paragraphing. Can the student draft and edit their own work? What's the error count here? We also check the capacity to reference, paraphrase, interpret the words of others, and build an argument between chapters. So we're looking at transitions between paragraphs, transitions between chapters. And also that in this read, and this is you've got to be focused, you're looking for internal consistency. So does this project hold together? Cool. As you can see, none of this is subjective. None of this is about a vibe. None of this is about comparing this thesis to your PhD. We're assessing academic and research protocols. So through this second read, you can see we've confirmed the organisation of the argument. The argument is sound. Writing and referencing, and the capacity to build a project from a gap in knowledge. So through this second read, you are endlessly returning to your report and adding sentences and comments. Okay, we're now at the final read, and we're about to complete the examination process. We're back to the digital draft, and this is crucial. Many universities now quite rightly send the text matching, so the Turnitin, the Authenticate reports to examiners. I think that is necessary. I think it should be required, and if your university that you're examining for is not sending it, you write to them and you get your hands on it. You have the right to that report, and most of us have software that we can use on our own terms as well. So you need all the information available so that you can examine this with rigour. You as an examiner cannot allow a thesis with academic integrity or research integrity issues to be passed. You must continue to gather information if you can't make a judgment on this concern. So you need to look, for example, in this draft, very carefully at the appendices, look at the ethics clearances, connect them up with the methodological selection. Is it all working well? And you need to go to the methodology and see, right, did the student at any point transgress what was agreed through the ethics clearances? So this is done at this draft. We also look at authorship statements. If there are co-authored articles or things in the chapters, then you need to know that it is the student's work. Now, this is increasingly difficult to determine. The best universities have formal strategies and structures and paperwork that is shared with the examiners, so they're able to guarantee, because it's signed off by all the authors, that the student did the bulk of the work on data collection and analysis, research design, but also substantive writing and editing. We need to know the work that we're examining belongs to the student whose name is on the cover. Full stop. Now, if you cannot guarantee that this is the student's work, then questions need to be asked of the university. One of the most amazing examples I heard about from an examiner, and the examiner did an amazing thing, logged that the articles that were submitted in the thesis, so basically we call this stapled in, so peer review articles were stapled in to a thesis, and the examiner confirmed that those articles were of such a higher standard compared to the rest of the thesis, so much better written, that he actually stopped the examination process and reported research integrity. So the thesis was removed from examination and went down the research integrity breach. Okay, so remember that academic and research integrity policies cluster around doctorates because this matters so much. There's often page after page, long policy, long procedure about the doctorate because there has to be. And this is a very, very serious matter. If an examiner lets through a thesis that is later shown to be plagiarised, or the student hasn't done the bulk of the work on that chapter or chapters, then the student and or the supervisor's careers are damaged and or destroyed, and of course the examiners are accountable for this breach. Right, so this final read, which I often do on Sunday mornings, can I say, this final read involves checking every reference and every quotation, time upon time upon time. And also when I'm reading it, I look for any familiarity or weirdness, so anything that's not quite right. So I grab that, scoop it up, and put it into a series of text matching protocols to see what comes up. And I do that page after page after page for the entire text. So our job, colleagues, is as the gatekeeper of standards. That's what we're doing here. And we are implicated if we miss errors, flaws, or challenges. Now, we're going to talk about this a little bit more next week, but a PhD oral examination, the next stage, has never been more important than it is right now. And we are having to change and rethink our assessment radically, not only through AI and generative AI, but the assumption that it's fine to use editors through a doctoral process. The student has to declare that, and the acknowledgements, that's fine. But also remember there's the culture of the PhD coaches as well. And the coaching protocol is deeply under-regulated. So what's going on here, we don't know as examiners. We are assessing the human being that is listed on the front page of this thesis. And we're having to confirm that they did the work that we are assessing. So we as examiners, our role is to guarantee that that student did that work and has received adequate research training and has produced this thesis. It's our responsibility to hold universities accountable to ensure that every student reaches these threshold standards. And we have to get all the framing and contextual information that we require to make that determination. I'll also offer one great example of when university regulations got it wrong. There is an Australian university, was a posh Australian university too, that specified in their regs unbelievably that examiners are not to assess refereed articles stapled into the thesis because they've already been assessed. Yes, a university, the regs, had confused refereeing and examination, but one examiner handled this situation incredibly well. He was a mathematician. Respect to all the mathematicians out there. And he wrote to the dean of this particular university that I'm aware you don't want to be informed of any research or academic integrity breaches. If they're in articles, that's fine. That's your regulations. But I need to let you know that I've reported that article to the journal and the article's now being investigated on the pathway to retraction. So as a professional courtesy, I'm just letting you know that. How would you like to proceed? Classy, classy. So this regulation silently slipped out of their policies very, very quickly because you see errors emerge from peer review all the time. And our role as examiners is not to take the word of peer reviewers, but to assess the entire doctorate, scope and scale. So we'll talk about the oral examination next week from the perspective of the examiner, and I won't be polite and quiet and shy. I'll tell you exactly what's going on there. And can I just be honest at this point, as I always try and be, if a university today is not running an oral examination and doesn't have independent external examiners, and notice I put the plural in there, then we have to really ask some serious questions about research integrity and standards at that institution. Now we're going to return to that matter next week. But team, you now have a methodology, a way of thinking and a way of examining a PhD. The privilege of examining a PhD must never be taken for granted. This is a human being of brilliance and compassion and is transforming knowledge. We must never take this process for granted. And can I say, examining a PhD, it's not about me, it's not about you, it's not actually about examiners. It's about the imperative to maintain international standards in research. We need to confirm academic and research protocols. We need to confirm authorship. So with all these benchmarks and protocols in place, and I hope an examination methodology working for you, we can become part of the solution to enable high quality doctoral education. I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out.